Before the first walls rose, before the first roofs bent against the weight of snow or rain, human beings lived beneath a sky both merciless and magnificent. Fire gave warmth, but it was never enough. A flame could flicker against the cold night, yet it could not stop the wind from cutting flesh or the rain from soaking bones. Tribes huddled close, their breath steaming in the dark, their survival always a fragile negotiation with nature's cruelty. It was not the fire alone that saved them, but the shelters they built. Frail huts of wood and bone, caves hollowed into the earth, skins stretched over branches like the fragile wings of hope. These shelters were more than walls. They were the difference between extinction and endurance, between silence and the stories that carried us into the future. If you find yourself drawn into these forgotten beginnings, stay with us. Support this journey by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your presence helps us keep these ancient echoes alive and retold. The night did not forgive. Long before humans could even dream of permanence, they lived in a world that showed no mercy for weakness. The open sky was vast and indifferent, beautiful when painted with stars, yet monstrous when torn by thunder. A flame could be coaxed to life with effort, nurtured with twigs and breath, but the fire only cast a narrow circle of protection. Beyond that glow, shadows thickened into shapes that could be predator or storm, death in either form. To live without walls was to live in constant negotiation with fear. Picture a small band of hunters and gatherers, their faces lined not by age, but by hunger and cold. Their camp lies beside a river that gleams faintly under a waning moon. They have skinned what little they could hunt, laid the hides on damp earth, and now sit in a loose ring around the fire. The children are pressed close to their mothers. The men stare outward, clutching sharpened stones that are as much comfort as weapon. The wind slips through their circle with a cruel edge, biting at exposed flesh, and in the distance, wolves cry out in a voice that chills the blood. These people are not weak. Their endurance is astonishing. Yet every night spent beneath the open sky chips away at their strength. When dawn comes, it does not bring relief. The ground is wet with dew, their bodies stiff, their energy drained not just by hunger, but by sleepless vigilance. Fire has burned down to ash, and the effort to coax it back into life feels endless. In these moments, the open world is not a gift, but a weight. The land offers food, but it also demands a constant toll. Too much rain and the hides rot. Too little and thirst scours the throat raw. Too much heat and bodies crack with thirst. Too much cold and the skin itself feels like stone. The vulnerability of exposure etched itself into the human mind long before language could hold the memory. A storm could sweep away the fragile possessions of a tribe in a single night. A sudden wind could scatter embers into the dark, leaving only smoke and silence. A predator could rush the edge of the camp, seizing a child before anyone stirred from exhaustion. This was life beneath the open sky. Survival balanced on the knife edge of chance. Yet even in this raw exposure, there was the stirring of thought. These people were not merely creatures enduring nature. They were observers. They watched birds weave twigs into nests, foxes curl into burrows, bears retreat to caves. The lessons of survival were written all around them, but unlike the animals, humans carried the burden of imagination. To see a bird's nest was not only to notice its shape, but to wonder what it might mean for themselves. Could twigs, if bound together, create something more permanent than a pile of skins on the ground? Could the earth itself offer shelter if dug deep enough? Curiosity became the first scaffolding of architecture. Still, in this earliest age, ideas were fragile. Building meant more work when every calorie already counted. Dragging branches took time away from hunting. Sealing gaps with mud meant hands frozen in icy rivers. To dream of shelter was to risk energy that could be wasted. But necessity has always been the cruelest teacher. When storms rolled in and fire hissed uselessly under rain, The tribe understood in their bones that fire alone could not shield them. Survival demanded something more. There is a moment one can imagine. The first night when a tribe pressed beneath a fallen tree trunk, its branches shielding them from rain. The sound of water striking leaves above instead of their own skin must have felt miraculous. The fire still burned, but it was quieter now, shielded from the downpour. In the morning, they rose not soaked and shivering, but only damp, still alive. From this moment, memory itself shifted. Humans did not forget that comfort. They carried it, told it, repeated it. And in that telling, the seed of architecture began to grow. What defined this time was the tension between awe and terror. The sky above was breathtaking, filled with stars so thick they seemed like spilled fire. Yet beauty could not be trusted. The same heavens could unleash lightning that struck the earth like a spear, setting dry grass ablaze. Tribes learned to fear not only predators, but the heavens themselves. To live without cover was to live at the mercy of forces vast and uncontrollable. But to imagine shelter was to imagine defiance, a small circle carved against the infinite. Every dawn after a storm brought reminders, bones scattered from the dead of other tribes, floods carving through valley paths, trees split into shards by lightning. Each scar of nature told the same story. Endurance without protection was not enough. The tribe's memory of nights beneath the open sky hardened into cautionary tales. And so, when young hunters spoke of trying to lash branches together, or when elders remembered the comfort of a hollowed rock, the idea was no longer dismissed. It was survival retold as strategy. The chapter of humanity beneath the open sky did not last forever, but it was long enough to carve instinct into our marrow. Even today, when we lie under stars, a thrill of vulnerability lingers. Something ancient stirs. A whisper of those first humans shivering against the dark, watching firelight fade, wishing for walls. They were not yet builders, not yet settlers, but they were the dreamers of roofs. And from those dreams would come the first fragile huts, the first signs that humans could bend the world to serve them, not only endure it. This was the beginning, the harshness that forced invention. The endless open sky was both the canvas and the threat, pressing humanity toward a future it could not yet see. Fire had given warmth, but it had never been enough. To survive the next storm, the next winter, the next night of howling predators, humans would need something more. And soon they would find it. The first true shelters were not grand designs, but desperate improvisations. They rose from hunger, cold, and fear, born in the moments when fire failed to protect. Imagine the scene: a storm rolling heavy across the plains, rain slicing sideways in sheets, wind pulling at the hides spread on the ground. A small tribe, too exhausted to keep moving, drags branches together, bending them into an arch, covering them with skins stretched taut. In that moment, the air inside feels warmer, quieter, less merciless. It is not safety yet, but it is a beginning. These crude domes of branch and hide were humanity's earliest experiments in defiance. Each was fragile, likely torn apart within days or weeks, yet the memory of comfort endured. What mattered was not permanence, but proof. For the first time, humans saw that the world outside could be bent to serve, that wooden skin could form a barrier between the body and the storm. Where once they crouched under trees or rocks, now they carried shelter with them. Invention was no longer an accident, but a choice. The earliest huts were built from what lay at hand. On grasslands, long reeds could be bundled into frames. In colder regions, mammoth bones became natural supports, their arcs forming perfect ribs for a roof. In forested lands, branches twisted together into domes sealed with leaves, moss, or mud. They were not houses in the sense we know them. They were barricades, stopgaps, fragile protections that might collapse at the next gust of wind. Yet every crude wall represented something greater. The moment survival crossed into intention. There is a certain poignancy in imagining the first roof lifting over a fire. Before this, smoke curled into the open night, carrying sparks into the stars. Now, smoke pressed against hides and wood, curling inward, forcing humans to carve openings, to experiment with gaps, to learn the delicate balance between protection and suffocation. These were the first lessons of architecture. Trial and error. Error paid in coughs and headaches, but lessons nonetheless. The fire had to live alongside the roof, and so design was born not from luxury, but from necessity. We can sense the fear that drove such creations. Picture a family huddled inside a low dome of branches during the crash of thunder. Rain lashes against the skin roof, but for once, it does not strike their faces. The wind claws outside, but the walls hold. The children sleep, something rare and precious, while their parents sit awake, marveling at this fragile reprieve. That memory carries forward, whispered to others, tried again, improved in small ways. Wordless teaching, children learning from watching, young hunters trying their hand at lashing reeds tighter, elders testing clay as a sealant. Slowly, generation by generation, the art of building took root. Still, these shelters were not yet homes. They were survival tools, just as much as spears or traps. The walls kept rain from soaking hides. The roofs slowed the wind. The narrow entrances kept predators wary. To call them homes would be premature, because permanence had not yet arrived. Nomadic life still demanded movement. Shelters were abandoned as easily as they were raised. But each time the tribe moved, each time they built anew, they carried the memory of better shelter with them. And with memory came refinement. The earth itself offered lessons. Caves, though dangerous, gave humans a glimpse of true protection. Stone walls that neither wind nor rain could breach. For some, the memory of cave nights lingered long after departure. To imitate stone, they packed mud into cracks of their makeshift huts. To mimic the darkness of a cavern, they draped skins to close off light. Every shelter, however humble, carried with it echoes of nature's own designs. Humans were no longer passive creatures enduring the elements. They were imitators, adapters, and slowly, creators. There is a haunting image that lingers from this age. The bone huts of Eastern Europe, where mammoth ribs arched into frames, tusks embedded into the ground, hides stretched across them like sails of survival. To enter such a shelter was to step inside a structure that merged life and death. The bones of a hunted beast transformed into the walls that kept the hunters alive. Fire flickered against ivory, shadows curling across curved surfaces, while the cold raged outside. In those huts, humanity crossed a threshold. They had turned the remains of nature's giants into monuments of their own endurance. It is tempting to imagine these early huts as crude, but they carried profound significance. For the first time, humans had created something larger than themselves, something that endured even while they slept. The roof was more than cover. It was continuity, an invention that lasted through the night when vigilance failed. Where once the open sky demanded constant fear, now walls could hold back a portion of that terror. For the first time, sleep could deepen, dreams could emerge, and in those dreams, perhaps, came the seeds of imagination that built the future. But every creation carried risk. Shelters collapsed under heavy snow. Fires lit too close to walls consumed them in an instant. Hides rotted, branches splintered, storms ripped roofs away. Still, failure did not erase the lesson. It refined it. Tribes learned to lash tighter, to dig deeper posts, to angle roofs against prevailing winds. Each mistake became a blueprint for the next attempt. This relentless trial and error was the silent curriculum of survival, taught not in words, but in scars. And so the world began to change. Where once a tribe's camp vanished without trace by dawn, now the land carried marks. Posts driven into the ground, depressions where huts had stood, ash circles where fires had burned beneath roofs. The earth itself began to remember humanity's presence. Shelters left behind were crude, but they spoke. Someone endured here, someone fought the storm, someone dreamed of walls. The first roofs against the storm were not triumphs of design, but triumphs of defiance. They said in their fragile frames that humanity would not simply bow to nature's cruelty. The tribe could now face a storm with more than a flame. They could answer with walls, however thin. And though these early shelters were easily lost, the memory of comfort they gave was never forgotten. Fire warmed the body, but roofs began to protect the soul. What began as crude barricades would, in time, grow into villages, temples, and cities. But in these first fragile huts lies the true genesis. Not stone towers or monuments, but the trembling frame of branches lashed against the rain. It was enough to keep the fire alive, to keep the children dry, to grant one more dawn of survival. From such fragile beginnings, civilization itself took its first hesitant breath. Winter was the great devourer. Unlike storms that came and passed, unlike predators that could be outrun or fought, winter lingered. It pressed down with the weight of months, each day colder than the last, each night longer, darker, more punishing. For tribes unprepared, it was not merely a season, it was a sentence. Beneath the open sky, winter meant death. With crude shelters, it meant a trial. Only through refinement would it become survivable. Imagine the first snow falling on a scattered camp. At first, it is almost beautiful. Flakes drifting through the air, settling softly on hides and branches. But beauty does not last. By nightfall, the ground is coated in ice. Fire struggles to keep its spark alive, and the cold burrows into the marrow of bone. Children cry without sound, their voices stolen by numbness. The wind moves differently in winter, not rushing, but creeping, finding every crack in a wall, every gap in a roof, and piercing through like a blade. In these conditions, the difference between a hut well sealed and one hastily built was the difference between survival and extinction. It was in winter that shelter became more than barrier. It became invention. A roof alone was not enough. Walls had to be sealed. Cracks had to be filled. Fires had to be controlled. Tribes learned to press mud into crevices, to layer moss against cold air, to dig shallow pits in the ground where warmth could pool. These were not luxuries. They were survival strategies. Each detail was discovered painfully, through nights where frostbite stole fingers, where sleep never came, where breath froze in the air before it could warm the lungs. And yet those who endured carried the knowledge forward. The weight of winter also reshaped human rhythm. Food grew scarce, and hunts grew longer, riskier. It was within the walls of shelters that people endured hunger, waiting for the return of spring. The fire inside became more than warmth, it became ritual. Stories lengthened, words stretched to fill the darkness, and myths gathered around the flames. In this way, winter not only tested the strength of walls, but the strength of culture. Shelter provided the pause that allowed imagination to ferment. One can picture a cluster of huts on the edge of a frozen river, smoke rising in thin lines against a white sky. Inside, people huddled together, bodies pressed close, wrapped in furs. The smell of smoke lingers on everything, hair, skins, breath itself. The air is thick, stinging eyes, but better to cough than to freeze. Children carve shapes in the dirt with sticks. Elders murmur warnings of winter's past, cautioning that hunger is more dangerous than wolves. Somewhere in the night, the sound of ice cracking across the river echoes like thunder. Yet inside the shelters, people endure. This endurance forged community. No longer could survival be left to individual strength. Winter demanded collective labor. One person could not build a hut strong enough, could not gather enough fuel, could not seal every crack alone. It took many hands to drag branches, to press clay, to stitch hides together. Winter forced humans to work as one, and in that unity, something new was born, the sense of tribe as more than hunters gathered for convenience. Shelter became the architecture of belonging, but the struggle was unrelenting. Fires consumed wood quickly, and the search for fuel often brought hunters into conflict with the frozen forest. Predators, too, were hungrier in winter, drawn by the scent of smoke and food scraps. The walls that kept out the cold also made humans more visible. A bear clawing at the side of a hut, wolves circling just beyond the smoke. These were not uncommon sights. The roof protected, but it also challenged nature directly, announcing, "We claim this space. We will not yield." Winter made this defiance sharper, riskier, yet necessary. The memory of winters survived, carried across generations. Tribes remembered the huts that failed, the children lost to frost, the cracks that let the wind in. Memory itself became a kind of insulation, layering each new shelter with wisdom gathered from the last. Clay thicker, entrances smaller, fires raised on stone to last longer, walls packed with reeds. These improvements were not sudden revolutions, but quiet accumulations of experience etched into practice by desperation. Winter also carved silence. Outside, snow muffled sound, turning the world into a hushed expanse where even footsteps disappeared quickly. Inside, silence pressed heavier still, broken only by the hiss of fire or the murmur of voices. It was in this silence that thought deepened, that fear mingled with imagination. Perhaps this is why so many myths took shape in winter, because the cold demanded reflection, and reflection demanded story. Shelters became not only walls against the cold, but theaters for the first rehearsals of culture. Consider the way shadows stretched inside a winter hut, firelight flickering across faces, turning them into masks of gods or spirits. A child would hear the crackle of flames as voices, the howl of wind as warning. Stories of cave spirits, of fire's sacred heart, of winter gods who demanded offerings. These grew naturally, seeded in the long nights when fear and wonder lived side by side. Shelter kept bodies alive, but stories kept spirits alive. Yet the lesson of winter was never forgotten. Survival demanded humility before the cold. Even the best huts could fail. Even the strongest tribes could weaken. To endure winter was to live with constant vigilance, to respect the balance between fire, shelter, and community. In this way, architecture and morality grew together. The walls of a hut were not only protection, they were also a reminder that no one could survive alone. By the end of each winter, the survivors emerged not just alive, but transformed. They had endured months of scarcity, of fear, of darkness, and in doing so, had bound themselves tighter to each other and to the land. The huts, patched and blackened with smoke, stood as symbols of victory. They were fragile, temporary things, yet they had carried life through the longest night. In that endurance, humanity found its rhythm. Winter was the teacher that forced humans to build better, to think deeper, to imagine further. It pressed them to turn crude barricades into true shelters, to transform survival from chance into craft. The weight of winter was immense, but it forged resilience as enduring as stone. And with each winter endured, humans moved closer to permanence, to villages, to traditions, to the first whispers of home. The first shelters were built for survival, but once the storm was kept at bay, something else stirred inside those fragile walls. The hearth was no longer just a flame for warmth and cooking. It became the axis around which memory and imagination revolved. When the winds screamed outside and snow pressed against the roof, when the fire hissed and spat but endured, people began to tell stories. They whispered of what they feared, of what they dreamed, of what they did not understand. Rumors thickened in the smoke. The shelter became not just protection from the elements, but a cradle for culture. Inside these huts, caves, and bone houses, the world shifted from silence to sound. The crackle of fire was joined by voices shaping the unknown into patterns the mind could endure. A wolf's howl became an omen. The shadow on the wall became a spirit. The simple act of explaining the unexplainable gave the shelter new power. It was not only walls against the cold, but a theater where imagination first performed. The roof, stitched from hide or branches, did not only keep rain away, it kept stories in. Imagine a small circle of people pressed close around firelight, their faces lit in flickers, their eyes wide as an elder leans forward. He speaks not of the hunt or of hunger, but of the night the storm spirit walked the earth, tearing trees from their roots. He says the spirit sought those foolish enough to sleep beneath the open sky. But those who huddled together beneath roofs were spared, for the spirit feared the power of warmth shared. The children listen in terror and relief, glancing at the walls that hold them now. Already the shelter has become something more, a symbol of protection sanctified by story. Rumors became explanations, explanations became traditions. The hearth was the center, but it was also the heart. Fire was life, yes, but it was also temperamental, demanding attention, fuel, and respect. To let it die was to court disaster. To keep it alive was to honor something sacred. And so fire took on a voice, a character. It became a being to be appeased, a god within the walls. The shelter magnified this reverence because it was here that fire proved its worth most fully, banishing the cold that would otherwise creep inside. In these nights of storytelling, the boundaries between reality and myth blurred. The cave's echoes became whispers of ancestors. The flutter of skins at the roof's edge became the breath of unseen beings. Rumors carried warnings of what happened to those who built poorly, who let the cracks in their walls invite winter spirits in. And through these stories, knowledge itself was passed. Children remembered not just the tale, but the lesson. Seal the walls, guard the fire, trust the shelter. Thus shelter became more than a structure. It became a sacred space. It was where the tribe gathered, where wisdom lived, where voices rose and merged. In the shelter, memory found walls to cling to. Without it, stories scattered like smoke on the wind. Within it, words lingered, echoed, and grew. This transformation was subtle yet monumental. Until then, survival was purely external. Food, warmth, safety. But now survival began to weave with meaning. People did not simply endure the storm, they gave it a face. They did not simply cluster in huts. They believed the walls kept out spirits as well as snow. Fear found form, and form became culture. Every rumor spoken inside the hut strengthened its value. It was not merely that the shelter kept people alive. It also gave their fears and hopes a place to take shape. There is power in the intimacy of shared darkness. When voices hush and firelight trembles, imagination swells. A child's eyes see shadows that adults know are just branches, but still the elder weaves them into the tale. The shadows are watchers, guardians, or demons. Whether real or not, the hut holds the story, the fire carries it, and the tribe remembers it. In time, these whispers grow into oral traditions that echo across generations. The hearth became the first altar. Not carved in stone or raised in temples, but glowing on earth floors, ringed with bones or stones to keep the flames contained. It was here offerings were made. A scrap of meat, a whispered prayer, the careful tending of flame at dawn. It was here the tribe came closest to mystery, not in the wilderness, but inside their own creation. Shelter gave shape to spirituality. Without walls, the wind would have carried these murmurs away. Within walls, they gained permanence. And with permanence came the first sense of belonging. To sit by the hearth was to be part of the tribe, to be included in the warmth and the words. Those outside the circle, outside the hut, outside the firelight, were not just cold, they were alone. Thus shelter became boundary, marking not only inside from outside, but us from them. Within the walls, one had place, identity, memory. Beyond them, one had only exposure. The role of rumor, of myth, cannot be understated. Where practical memory built better huts, imaginative memory built better bonds. The story of the winter spirit, of the fire god, of the cave's ancestors, made every act of building carry meaning beyond survival. To patch a roof was to honor the ancestors. To tend the fire was to feed the god. To close a doorway was to keep evil at bay. Shelter was transformed into something sacred because it was tied not just to the body, but to the soul. We may never know the exact words spoken in those huts, never hear the tone of the first myths, but their traces remain. In later centuries, hearths became altars, huts became temples, stories became scripture. Yet at the root of all of it lies the moment when a group of people pressed together in a fragile dome of wood and skin and spoke into the darkness to make sense of their fear. Shelter was not only what saved them from the cold, it was what gave their voices an echo chamber. It turned fleeting rumor into lasting tradition. Thus, in Chapter 3, we see the great shift. Humanity had learned to build walls not just to survive storms, but to build meaning within them. The first roofs against the storm became more than survival. They became sanctuaries of memory. Fire warmed the body, but stories warmed the spirit. Within the shelter, the two merged, and culture itself was born. For countless generations, shelters had been temporary. Fragile domes of branch and hide, bone and clay, raised only to be abandoned when food ran out or predators grew bold. Yet slowly, something shifted. The shelters became sturdier, more carefully built, and more tightly clustered together. No longer were they only barriers against storms, they became the anchors of something new. The beginning of villages, and with them, the dawn of belonging. It is difficult to trace the exact moment when humanity first chose to stay instead of move, but its significance cannot be overstated. Nomadic life had been the rule for so long, dictated by the chase of herds and the turning of seasons. But as shelters improved, as walls held against winter and roofs no longer collapsed under snow, people began to linger. What was once a pause in the hunt grew into something longer. A place to rest became a place to return to. Soon, a place to return to became a place to remain. Picture a small clearing at the edge of a forest, where smoke rises not from one fire, but from many. Huts stand in a circle, their walls thick with mud and reeds, their entrances facing inward to a central space where the largest fire burns. Children run between them, laughter echoing, while women grind seeds on stone slabs, and men return from hunting with their kills slung across shoulders. It is no longer a single family clinging to warmth, but many families bound by the walls they have built side by side. This is the first village. Fragile, fleeting perhaps, but revolutionary. Belonging begins here, within these clusters of huts. For the first time, people know not just survival, but community rooted in place. Shelter is no longer only protection from cold and storm. It is a statement. This is where we are. This is who we are. A wall of reeds hardened with clay becomes a boundary between the tribe and the wilderness. A roof patched with moss becomes the difference between chaos and order. To live together in clustered shelters is to recognize that strength lies not only in numbers, but in nearness. This nearness reshaped human life in ways far beyond survival. With people living together for longer stretches, knowledge grew thicker. Techniques for sealing huts, storing food, weaving reeds or tanning hides were no longer scattered across wandering groups, but concentrated, shared, and refined. Children watched many hands working, learned from many voices. What one family discovered about fire pits, another added with the use of stone walls. The village became a crucible of knowledge. But with belonging came responsibility. In a wandering band, disputes could dissolve with movement. If conflict grew, one could leave. In a village, the walls tied people together, forcing them to endure one another as well as the weather. A cracked roof was no longer just one family's concern. Leaks spread, smoke carried, and neighbors suffered. Cooperation became not just desirable, but essential. Thus, the first rules emerged, not laws carved in stone, but shared expectations spoken around the hearth. Shelter demanded maintenance, and maintenance demanded unity. There is also something more intangible here, the first spark of identity tied to place. To sleep in the same hut for season after season, to see the same fire pit at dawn, to watch the same walls darken with smoke, was to anchor the self to a location. Where once people were defined only by their movement, now they were defined by their dwelling. This is our camp, our circle, our home. That claim may have been whispered more than shouted, but in it lies the seed of belonging that would one day grow into nations. The symbolism of shelter deepened. A hut was not only walls, but lineage. Parents built for their children, who grew up with the memory of those walls, who then built their own nearby. In this way, the village stretched across generations. The continuity of place created continuity of memory. Stories were no longer of a camp left behind, but of a fire that always burned in the center, of huts that always stood, of people who always belonged. Shelter became history. Consider also how permanence reshaped the natural world. Where once huts vanished into the wilderness, villages left scars. Trees were cut, clay pits dug, stones dragged. The land itself bore the imprint of human dwelling, not erased each season, but layered year after year. With this, people began to see the land not as something to move through, but something to claim. The first sense of territory was born from the simple act of staying. Yet permanence also brought vulnerability. To remain in one place meant to defend it. A cluster of huts was easier to find than a wandering band, easier for predators, and eventually for rival humans. The roof and wall that gave safety also tethered the tribe to danger. This paradox, that belonging makes one strong but also makes one vulnerable, is as old as the first village. Still, people chose to stay. The promise of belonging outweighed the risk of exposure. Inside the huts, life began to change. With more hands and more time, tasks became specialized. Some gathered food, others wove baskets, others patched roofs. Efficiency grew, and with it, creativity. Art scratched into walls, ornaments carved from bone, patterns painted on hides. These were more than decoration. They were expressions of identity. To adorn a wall was to say, "This is mine, this is us." Villages turned shelter into something not just practical, but meaningful. As the generations passed, the first whispers of inheritance stirred. Huts became associated not just with those who lived in them now, but those who came before. A fire pit carried memory, a roof beam carried lineage. To lose a shelter was to lose part of one's story. To rebuild it was to honor those who had endured before. Belonging deepened into legacy. Thus, in these first villages, humanity transformed its relationship to survival. The shelter was no longer only a fragile answer to the cold. It was the foundation for culture, continuity, and belonging. A wall was no longer just mud and reed. It was the skin of community. A roof was no longer just moss and hide. It was the promise that tomorrow would rise in the same place as today. The dawn of belonging had begun. Where once fire had been enough for a night, now huts were enough for a lifetime. The village marked humanity's first true step toward civilization. A step taken not in grandeur, but in the quiet construction of walls side by side. And though fragile, though easily destroyed, these villages carried within them the promise of permanence. Fire had warmed the body, but shelter now warmed the soul. Long after the earliest huts have collapsed, after the reeds rotted and the hides turned back into earth, something of them remains. Not in the wood or bone, not in the clay pressed into cracks, but in the idea they carried. That to be human was not only to endure, but to build a place in which endurance could take root. Shelter became more than protection. It became memory, an inheritance passed from those who first bent branches against the rain to every dwelling that rose afterward. There is a haunting beauty in this truth. The first huts were temporary, but the thought of them is eternal. They did not last through centuries, but their presence echoes in every wall we raise today. Our houses of wood and stone, our towers of steel and glass, even our cities stretching across horizons, all carry within them the same ancient impulse that drove a mother to tuck her children beneath a roof of stretched hide and whisper, "Here, you are safe." Shelter is not simply a structure, it is a gesture, a promise, a memory carved into the human condition. In this light, the primitive hut becomes something almost sacred. The fire gave warmth, but it was never enough. A flame alone could not preserve memory. Flames vanish. Smoke rises. What remains is the roof that kept the flame alive, the walls that preserved the voices around it, the sense of belonging those fragile boundaries created. The hut was memory solidified, the first monument not to gods or kings, but to survival itself. It is no coincidence that later civilizations built temples, shrines, and palaces with the same essential elements. Walls to enclose, roofs to shelter, fires or lamps at the center to sanctify. These were not inventions born suddenly. They were magnifications of the first lessons. The hearth became altar. The hut became sanctuary. The village became city. Yet at the core of every stone laid in order, every beam raised to hold weight, lies that primal truth. When fire wasn't enough, humanity learned to enclose it. Consider how shelter changed the way humans perceived time. For a nomadic band, days were measured by movement, the next valley, the next hunt, the next dawn on unfamiliar ground. But with walls came continuity. A child grew up seeing the same shadows fall across the same roof beams. Elders told stories not only of winters survived, but of winters survived in this place, under these walls. Time became rooted. Memory became anchored. The idea of home, fragile as it first was, grew into the foundation of human identity. And yet, even as shelters grew stronger, their impermanence was never forgotten. Storms toppled them, fire consumed them, enemies burned them, time itself eroded them. To build was always to fight against loss, but to build again was to affirm memory. Each reconstruction was an act of defiance against forgetting. The memory of those who huddled inside, of the stories told in smoke, of the hunger endured, of the laughter shared, all of it lingered within the act of building anew. To raise walls was to resurrect memory. The philosophical weight of this is profound. Shelter is the first human creation that insists upon continuity. A spear may break in the hunt, a tool may be lost, but a hut is raised for tomorrow. It says, we will still be here when the sun rises. It is hope made physical. And so, when we look back at those fragile huts, those bone houses and mud domes, we are not looking only at structures. We are looking at the earliest human philosophy. To build was to believe in a future. This belief is why shelter became more than survival. It became a metaphor. Even in language, the words we use for safety, memory, belonging, all carry echoes of walls and roofs. To be sheltered is not only to be protected from rain, but to be embraced, remembered, held. When ancient tribes sealed cracks with moss, they were not only blocking wind, they were weaving the first definition of care. We might imagine the last night in one of those bone huts on the plains. The tribe, grown, ready to move, leaves behind the frame of mammoth ribs, the blackened hearth at its center. The wind will claim it, the earth will reclaim it. But in the minds of those who depart, the memory is alive. The roof that held against the storm, the warmth that endured, the stories told within. That memory will shape the next hut and the next, until memory itself becomes tradition. It is easy, in our age of stone towers and glass cities, to forget the fragility of beginnings. Yet in every home, in every wall that separates us from the wind, in every fire we gather around, we are repeating the same gesture as our ancestors. We are saying, fire is not enough, but with shelter we can endure, and in enduring we can remember. Thus, the story of prehistoric shelter is not only the story of survival, it is the story of identity, continuity, and the birth of what it means to be human. To build a wall was to create memory. To raise a roof was to preserve belonging. To cluster huts was to invent community. And to gather around a fire within those walls was to shape story, myth, and meaning itself. The first shelters may have collapsed long ago, but they remain within us. They live in the instinct to draw curtains against the night, in the warmth we feel when we step inside from the rain, in the hush that falls when we gather by a fire. They live in the word home. They live in the unbroken memory that stretches from those fragile huts of bone and hide to the skyscrapers of steel and glass. When fire wasn't enough, humanity raised walls, and in those walls, humanity found itself.